Hello, friends, and Happy New Year. Welcome to the first annual Danny's Choice Awards, where I am giving out awards to books and authors that defined my reading year. Rather than ranking my top 10, I decided to talk through a few fun superlative categories before closing with my own big three categories, which are Best Nonfiction, Best Backlist Fiction, and Best 2025 Fiction. So before we jump into the awards, I wanted to zoom out for a second and look at my reading stats for the year. And I think looking at these stats helps contextualize why I set up my categories the way I did. In 2025, I read 87 books total. Most of that was backlist fiction, 51 books, which I'm defining as any book that was published in English prior to 2025. I read 26 new fiction releases and only 10 total nonfiction. I read 6 new nonfiction and 4 backlist nonfiction. I also took a look at how much I read in different genres, and to do this, I pretty much forced myself to give each book I read one primary genre, and with that method, the statistics show that I primarily read contemporary fiction and fantasy, followed by historical fiction, nonfiction, and sci-fi, with other genres falling off after that. With that context in mind, let's start handing out some awards. The first award I am giving out is New Favorite Author. These are writers I had never read before this year and that I am now genuinely excited to keep reading from. This is an author category, but I've picked one representative book for each author, even though in some cases I did read more than one book from that author. So first we have Layla Lalami, whose novel The Dream Hotel really stuck with me. The Dream Hotel is about a woman who is unexpectedly but lawfully detained at the airport because the data in her dreams predict that she is at risk of harming her husband. So she is placed under observation for 21 days to prevent anything tragic from happening. This is one of those books that I think some sci-fi readers might dismiss as literary fiction and sci-fi clothing, but I really do think this is a lot more specific and tech forward in its world building than many other literary sci-fi dystopias. This book I thought was so eerie and observant about how civil liberties are eroded through technology and capitalist forces, and it covers a lot of ground without feeling overwhelming. At least that's what I thought. And I am very excited to read more from Layla Lalami. Next, we have Stephen Graham Jones, who I read for the first time with The Buffalo Hunter. I have not historically read a lot of horror, but I have read a lot of vampire fiction this year, both classics and more modern works, and this is probably my favorite of all of them. What I loved is how Stephen Graham Jones places this novel in a lineage with classic vampire stories with its form. It is an epistolary novel like Dracula is, and like most of the vampire books I read this year were, but he uses this classic Gothic theme or trope of the vampire representing the old world that is infringing upon the new world. And he uses that to tell a story of the Native American vampire causing terror by forcing us to reckon with America's shameful history. And I just thought this book was so beautifully written and so meticulously written that it definitely made me want to read more horror and more Stephen Graham Jones. Next is Richard Osman, who brought some much needed levity to my reading this year. We are now getting into writers of series that I am excited to continue. I read We Solve Murders early in the year and The Thursday Murder Club more recently, and I was happily surprised with how much I enjoyed them. I tend to read fairly serious, gloomy books. I just drift to those books for some reason. And I'm pretty picky about cozy or comedic writing, but Osman really hits the right balance for me of funny and sweet and sentimental. And most importantly, I think he just has like these sharp observations in there. And I'm sure I'll be slowly and steadily working my way through the rest of these books from Richard Osman. Next is Solveig Balla, who is a Danish author. I read volumes 1 and 2 of On the Calculation of Volume this year, and I already have volume 3 on hold at my library. This is a planned septology built around a time loop. One woman is reliving the same day over and over. And I think what makes this special is how Balla uses that premise to explore really unique themes about time and consumption and loneliness and the tedium of everyday life. These are not plot-driven books at all, and I often bounce off of meditative writing like this, but the ideas here really captivated me. And finally, Christopher Buehlman, whose books I've been seeing recommended more and more lately on BookTube and Reddit, and for good reason. I read The Black Tongue Thief early this year and was just immediately obsessed. That book is a very classic D&D type adventure fantasy of the type that you almost don't see anymore. But I immediately felt like I was in great hands the entire time, and I went on to read The Daughter's War and The Lesser Dead, which is a top 2 vampire book of the year for me. So without further ado, the winner of New Favorite Author is Christopher Buehlman. What really stands out to me about Buehlman's writing across both horror and fantasy is how well he integrates culture and cultural difference into his stories. He captures both the beauty of cultural contact and the violence of it and the friction that can come from cultures colliding. And he does this without ever feeling heavy-handed or prescriptive, and it makes his worlds feel genuinely lived in. And if you haven't gotten on the Christopher Buehlman bandwagon yet, I invite you to hop on it. The next category is Old Favorite Author. These are authors that I had read prior to 2025, but in 2025, I either revisited their work after a long time, or I read new work from them that solidified them as a favorite author for me. Dorothy Dunnett is known for writing these historical fiction epics, and one of my big goals for the year was to revisit her by reading the first 4 books in the House of Niccolo series. Her writing is so complex and intricate, with adventure and intrigue, and with so much medieval history baked in. I have not yet encountered another writer like Dorothy Dunnett. Hong Kong is another author I read a lot from this year. I reread The Vegetarian, and I read Human Acts for the first time, and I read her newest novel in translation, We Do Not Part. She writes about violence and political trauma in a really restrained and emotionally impactful way, and I know there's still more of her work out there that I want to get to. Lily King is an author that I had kind of forgotten about in the reading hiatus of my grad school years. I read Euphoria in 2015, and I remembered loving that book even though I didn't remember many of the details of it. So I picked up Heart the Lover this year, and the things that I loved about Lily King's writing came rushing back to me. She creates these characters with thought processes that make me feel very seen, flaws and all. And she doesn't over-explain, but you as the reader are free to interpret the subtext in her writing. And then Nicola Dinan is a much newer author who I am locking in as a favorite. I read her debut novel Bellies last year, which was just an exceptional queer coming-of-age story. And this year she released a book about a millennial 30-year-old trans woman settling into a relatively mundane and stable heteronormative relationship, which sounds probably dreadfully boring when I say it like that, but I think Dinan does a wonderful job of portraying and digging into the complexities of modern relationships. There is just something to be said about writing that makes you feel seen, and she is writing to my millennial soul. And then finally, Sophia Samatar is another author that I discovered only last year when I read Tender, and who I'm locking in as a favorite this year after reading the Winged Histories. Sophia Samatar is writing in a sci-fi fantasy space where I don't see many other people writing about the same topics that she does with the delicate touch that she does. In both her short story collection and this novel, she writes a lot about religion and about myth making, which I think of as like the stories we tell ourselves and others. And she writes with such nuance and without over inserting her own stance into the text. You can tell I like that. And so with that, if I had to choose one, my old favorite author of the year is Dorothy Dunnett. It had to be. It was my year of the House of Niccolo. She is such a good sentence level writer, but she is also a great paragraph level writer and plot crafter. I have waxed poetic about her before, so watch my review of Niccolo Rising, but Dunnett is really the only person who could have won this category this year. And then the next category is biggest disappointment. First up, we have Emily Wilde's Compendium of Lost Tales by Heather Fawcett. This is the final book in the series. This one was just a funny misalignment of expectations in some ways, because what I liked about the first book was the lack of focus on romance. And then as the series progressed, it just became more like a traditional romance. And that's really mostly on me. Next is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I had absorbed some hype around this book from BookTube, and I think I had really high expectations for a post-colonial Gothic novel, but it ended up just feeling pretty bland to me, unfortunately. And then The Backyard Bird Chronicles by Amy Tan. I got into birding this past year, so I was excited to read this one, but it ended up being both less informative and less memoir than I was looking for. The art was very cool, but the writing was just not for me. Next is The Long Walk by Stephen King. This was only my second Stephen King book after I read Misery last year, and I loved Misery, and therefore I was surprised that I could not stand this book. It just felt so juvenile to me. I was shocked and dismayed at how much I disliked The Long Walk. And finally, Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins. I can appreciate that The Long Walk was an early example of the death game concept in literature. The Long Walk walked so that the Hunger Games book could run, but Sunrise on the Reaping, I thought, didn't really contribute anything above and beyond the original Hunger Games trilogy, in my opinion. And if you couldn't tell, my biggest disappointment of the year is The Long Walk. I hated this book. I think I gave it 2 stars, and it should probably be a 1-star book. Actually, in hindsight, it's hard to understand why I finished the book at all. But this brings us to our next category, which is the best bookish adaptation that came out this year. And the first nominee is The Long Walk, directed by Francis Lawrence, also the director of the Hunger Games movies. And the movie, in my opinion, improved on the book, both because it compressed the amount of time that I was sitting with the story. I think it's actually quite an elegant premise conceptually, that 100 boys walk until there's 1 boy left. But because of that, I think I just got tired of it more quickly, and I also think the movie had a more interesting ending, though I know that there are detractors of the book ending and detractors of the movie ending, and so it's a controversial topic in general, but I liked the movie better. Next we have Murderbot, which got its first season on Apple TV earlier this year. I thought this did a great job of keeping the feeling and a majority of the plot of the first Murderbot book intact, but adapting it in ways that made more sense for television. And, you know, everyone reads a book differently, but having read the first 4 books very shortly before I watched the TV show, the tone felt to me very true to the books. I thought they nailed the mixture of comedy and quirkiness and emotion and sentimentality that the books have. Next is the only adaptation on this list where I haven't actually read the source material. I was debating with myself about my internal rules for category qualification for my own choice awards, but I liked the movie, so it's going on the list. Mickey 17, directed by Bong Joon-ho, is based on a novel called Mickey 7. Obviously, I couldn't tell you how well the movie adheres to the book, but I thought Robert Pattinson was hilarious as a disposable clone, and the movie hits a lot of themes that Bong Joon-ho favors, like class and greed and environmental exploitation. It is a little on the goofy side. It leans more towards Okja than the Parasite side of things, but it was a fun movie. Next is Hamnet, directed by Chloe Zhao. Talk about nailing the tone from the book. Most issues that I have with the movie are issues that I also had with the book, and both versions of the story made me weep, and both of them were quite tough for me to get into in the first third. They're just kind of slow-paced in the first third. The movie, I thought, was tremendously well acted by Jessie Buckley, and I'm looking forward to seeing how she does in this award season. The Golden Globes are later tonight as I'm filming this, so we'll see. And finally, Frankenstein, directed by Guillermo del Toro. This movie was his take on a more faithful Frankenstein adaptation. And I do think philosophically it retains a lot of the core of the novel, and we get to see Guillermo del Toro's gothic aesthetics applied to it. Unfortunately, I felt like the aesthetics were conceptually really great, but not always executed great. Not always executed to the highest level. The CGI was tough sometimes. And for me, the winner of Best Bookish Adaptation is Murderbot. Hamnet is going to be the most critically acclaimed of this bunch, and I do recommend watching Hamnet, but Murderbot just really nailed the assignment in my opinion. I rewatched this series over the holidays with my dad, and it was a lot of fun. It is also incidentally exactly where my taste and my dad's taste in media overlap, so this is my personal winner. Next up is the Best Shorty. These are all books under 200 pages. My first nominee is The River Has Roots by Amal El-Matar. This was a retelling of a murder ballad called The Two Sisters, but it's set in a fantasy fairy universe. The prose is beautiful, and that is really more of the appeal in this book than the plot, which is quite straightforward, but the audiobook was also especially fantastic because of the way it includes music and singing and sound effects. My second nominee is Small Boat by Vincent Delacroix. This was translated from French by Helen Stevenson, and this is a very heavy novella. It is a fictionalized account of a real tragedy in which a small inflatable boat that was carrying migrants from France to the United Kingdom sank, resulting in the deaths of 27 people on board. The first section of this novella follows an interview with the distress call operator as part of the follow-up investigation into the tragedy, because the French distress call operator received several calls from the boat as they were sinking and failed to send a boat to their rescue. It is a really powerful and unsettling book that makes you think about empathy and culpability, and it is very interesting the way that it explores those topics. My third nominee is On the Calculation of Volume 1 by Sophie Falla. I already talked about this one earlier. This series is about a time loop, a Groundhog Day time loop, and this book and Small Boat are both very philosophical, and I think that this kind of book works well in small packages, which is why it's here. They're not plot driven, but they plant a little seed that shifts your thinking for a while after you read them. The fourth nominee is Hunchback by Sao Ichikawa, translated from Japanese by Polly Barton. This is the shortest book here at under 100 pages, but it is a very punchy account of what it is like to live in a severely disabled body. It's written to be a bit ambiguous and provocative and make you question your own conscious and unconscious prejudices and beliefs around disability. I wouldn't say that this book is necessarily an enjoyable reading experience, but it was a thought-provoking and important one. And the final nominee is Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. The audiobook on this was under 6 hours, and that's if you're listening on normal speed. I think it can be tough to thread the needle on how much information to give in a nonfiction book for the most impact, and I think John Green nailed it here. He threads memoir and information about the history of tuberculosis together in the most perfect way, with just enough detail to advocate for global healthcare equity and show why it should be important to everyone, especially people living in a world where tuberculosis is effectively eradicated. And my winner for this category is Small Boat. This book put me in an introspective daze after I read it. I just need to give this book credit for the way that it has stayed in my thoughts for months. Very powerful, very important book. And now we are moving on to the first of our 3 major categories, which is Best Nonfiction. Crying an H Mark by Michelle Zauner is a book I finished right before the end of the year. I don't tend to read a lot of celebrity memoirs if Michelle Zauner is considered a celebrity. She's the lead vocalist of Japanese Breakfast, which makes her a celebrity to me, but I think they got nominated for Best New Artist at the Grammys the year after this book came out, which makes me wonder actually if maybe they broke out because of this book and not the other way around. I don't know. I should look into that. Anyway, I don't read a lot of straight memoirs, but I liked this one. Michelle Zauner explores her grief over her mother and her mixed race identity through her relationship to food. And I think all of those entry points makes it a book that is both relatable and eye-opening to a lot of audiences. Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age by Vahini Vara is another book that snuck in late in the year. Vara began her career in the 2000s as a tech reporter. More recently, her novel, The Immortal King Rao, about a tech billionaire who becomes king of the world, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. I have not read that book yet, but Searches makes me want to. This book is part memoir, part reporting, part critical exploration of AI as a tool. This book explores the way our psychology and our creativity bends to the technology around us in ways that are profound and also alarming. And I think Vara rides that balance really, really well. Everyone Who's Gone Is Here by Jonathan Blitzer is a book about the history of U.S. immigration from Central America. I think a political, historical nonfiction about U.S. foreign and domestic policy sounds like it could be so boring. This could have been so boring, but he humanizes the story with these portraits of the people involved, from immigrants to their family members to activists, so that the reporting is rigorous, but it is also really compassionate. And I just thought this was so informative and so carefully written and so important to our current moment. There Is No Place for Us by Brian Goldstone is similar. This is a book about the working homeless in Atlanta who are not counted in official statistics of homelessness because they are not living on the street, but they are often living in extended stay hotel rooms or couch surfing or living in their cars. This is primarily told through narrative portraits of 5 families, and definitely one of the most important nonfiction books I read this year. And then finally, Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. I already talked about this one in my shorties category, and the impact it had on me, and its short page count is incredible. And the winner for this category is Everyone Who's Gone Is Here by Jonathan Blitzer. You can tell looking through this list that I like nonfiction that does serious social and political analysis through the lens of personal storytelling. And this is one of the most expertly executed nonfiction books I've ever read in that vein. And it is talking about one of the most urgent topics of the year here in the US. And I really can't recommend this book enough. Moving on to the best backlist fiction category. This is for the books I read that were published in any year prior to 2025. The Black Tongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman popped up earlier under my best new author category. It's got to be my favorite fantasy book that I've read all year. It was funny, it was harrowing, it was observant, it does it all. I also talked about Hong Kong a bit in the old favorite authors category. And Human Acts is my favorite book of hers that I have read so far. It is an extremely haunting exploration of a deeply tragic part of Korean history and the long shadow that violence and trauma casts on a society. And I thought this was a really powerful, moving book. David Copperfield by Charles Dickens was a big surprise for me this year. I was so intimidated to read this book, mostly because it's long. And I was like, how interesting can a coming-of-age story from Victorian England be? But that was stupid, and I was wrong. There were so many clever, funny observations in this book, and that's the joy of reading classics, really, is how timeless they are and how recognizable to us now they still are. Nicola Rising by Dorothy Dunnett is next. I talked about this one a bit earlier, too. Dorothy Dunnett is so underrated. Her writing is so intricate, but so emotionally heightened. And in this book, she has this way of tying personal drama to large-scale historical, political drama that is just so fun and impactful. And finally, James by Percival Everett. It's been out a couple of years now, and it is as good as everyone has been saying that it is. It's a retelling of Huck Finn from the perspective of the Black slave, Jim. There are so many reimaginings and retellings of classics out there, but I think it takes something special to both honor and challenge the original text like James does. And the winner of the best backlist fiction category is The Black Tongue Thief. Listen, it's really hard to rank these because they're obviously so different and I love them for different reasons, but The Black Tongue Thief reminded me of why I like fantasy and of what I like in fantasy, and it was just such a page turner as I was reading it that I have to honor it. And finally, we bring ourselves to the 2025 fiction category. I have talked about most of these already, so I'll try to zip through most of them. First up, The Dream Hotel by Layla Lalami. When you pair this with searches from my nonfiction category, technology and AI and the way it shapes our lives and our psychology were a big topic of interest for me this year. I think the questions in The Dream Hotel are very of this moment. The questions about privacy and about how willing we are individually or as a society to roll over and accept the way technology has changed our lives and invaded our privacy. And within that, it's an interesting, compelling page turner with great characters. Heart the Lover by Lily King is a college and after novel, as I call it, where you see our main character in her final years of college and you see how her decisions shake out in adulthood. Specifically, this is the story of an unnamed female creative writing major who is pulled into the orbit of two nerdy boys in her senior year. And we get a love triangle situation, and you get to see how that plays out into adulthood. This book is about the multiple people we become throughout our lives and about seizing opportunity, and it made me weep. Don't let the bright orange cover fool you. Pay attention to the tears on the cover. And The Buffalo Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones is another one that I talked about earlier. I'm reminded about what I said about James, both honoring and challenging the source material in a way that was really compelling. This book does the same thing for the genre of vampire literature. Small Boat by Vincent Delacroix, I talked about on my Shorties list. It takes a tragic event that we would usually think about briefly or in very simplistic terms, and it opens it up for much deeper questioning that has obviously stuck with me for a long time. And Endling by Maria Reba, I can't believe hasn't come up in this video already. It's a bit hard to describe this book. It's about a snail researcher, a malacologist named Yeva, who is concerned with the preservation of a snail species on the verge of extinction. But because funding is hard to come by, she earns money by being part of the marriage tourism industry in the Ukraine. She connects with a pair of activist sisters who have hatched this plot to kidnap a truck full of these bachelors as part of a feminist protest against the marriage industry. And this absurd plot has just kicked off when the Russian invasion of Ukraine starts. It's a book that is funny and tragic and absurd and very experimental in its form. If you are open to postmodern literature and you haven't already picked this one up, then you should. And my pick on this day for Best 2025 Fiction is Heart the Lover by Lily King. I think this is probably the most widely appealing book on this list, but that's not why I chose it. I do, though, want to give credit to a simple story that was executed very well. I think especially for these last three categories, on any given day, I might choose a different book, which is part of why I decided to go with this awards route. But that is what I have today for the 2025 Book Awards. Thank you so much for watching. I would love to hear your favorite books of the year in these categories or your own categories. This time of year, when everyone's talking about their favorites from last year and their intentions for this year, this is my favorite time on BookTube. May we all read good books in 2026 as well. Goodbye.